Hey everybody, this video is called How to Treat Skin Diseases. And tonight we're continuing our pass-through study in the book of Leviticus, looking at chapter 13, where we're going to be looking at some very serious skin diseases and what the law calls for in treatment. So let's look at verses 1 through 8 starting out. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, When a man has on the skin of his body a swelling, a scab, or a bright spot, and it becomes on the skin of his body like a leprous sore, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of the sons of the priest. The priest shall examine the sore on the skin of this body, and if hair on the sore has turned white, and that sore appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is leprous sore. Then the priest shall examine him and pronounce him unclean. But if a bright spot is white on the skin of his body and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and its hair has not turned white, then the priest shall isolate the one who has the sore 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day, and indeed, if the sore appears to be as it was, and the sore has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall isolate him another 7 days. Then the priest shall examine him again on the 7th day. And indeed, if the sore has faded, and the sore has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is only a scab, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scab should at all spread over the skin, after he has been seen by the priest for his cleansing, he shall be seen by the priest again. And if the priest sees the scab has indeed spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy." So we start the section here that covers laws pertaining to skin diseases. And what we see here is that the priests were serving as public health officers, and they would diagnose disease from carefully defined criteria. It was not what you might see today when you go to your primary care doctor, where you might see them going off instincts or guessing. And what this law of Moses has called for is the methodology in the passage focuses on the side of safety. And if a person couldn't be pronounced clean with certainty, then they were to be isolated until they could be pronounced clean. And these judgments were based on sound medical diagnosis and concern, and it focused on protecting the community from the outbreak of disease rather than the idea of the rights of the individuals. And the Hebrew priests were the first in the ancient world to isolate people that were suspected of carrying an infectious disease or contagious disease. And illnesses such as smallpox, measles, and scarlet fever might start out with a skin condition considered to be leprosy, and the person isolated for the necessarily time until the condition was cleared up. And the purpose of the quarantine was to help prevent the spread of these diseases among the people of Israel, just like we know the word quarantine today more than ever before with COVID. And when you are a potential exposer to COVID, you are asked to take a quarantine period of time to try to reduce the spread of the virus. In verse 9 through 11, it says, "When the leprosis sore is on the person, then he shall be brought to the priest. And the priest shall examine him, and indeed if the swelling on the skin is white, and it has turned the hair white, and there is a spot of raw flesh in the swelling, it is an old leprosy on the skin of his body. The priest shall pronounce him unclean, and shall not isolate him, for he is unclean." So, unlike doctors today, as mentioned before, God did not want guesswork. God didn't want people to go off their medical opinions and all that. And God is calling in the Mosaic law here for careful examination of physical signs for this skin disease. And leprosy was a horrible disease that started with small red spots, and then it would get bigger and then turn white with shiny and a scaly type appearance, and they would spread over the body, and hair would begin to fall out of the head. And this isn't talking about when you get as an older male where your hair falls out of your head, but it would also cause hair to fall out of people's eyebrows, and fingernails and toenails became loose. They would rot and they would fall off as this disease escalated. And then the joints of the fingers and the toes would begin to rot and start falling off piece by piece. And the gums started shrinking and they could not hold teeth. And leprosy kept eating away at the face until the nose was literally lost and the palate and the eyes, not as the victim, wastes away until death. In verse 12 through 17, and if leprosy breaks out all over the skin, and the leprosy covers all the skin of the one who has the sore, from his head to his to his foot, wherever the priest looks, then the priest shall consider, and indeed, if the leprosy was covered all his body, he shall pronounce him clean who has the sore. It has all turned white, he is clean. But when raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean. And the priest shall examine the raw flesh and pronounce him to be unclean, for the raw flesh is unclean. It is leprosy. Or if the raw flesh changes and turns white again, he shall come to the priest, and the priest shall examine him, and indeed, if the sore has turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. Who has the sore? He is clean. So once the body was covered with leprosy, when this disease ran its course, and if they survived, they were considered clean, and then they could enter into the place of worship. In verse 18 through 28 says, if the body develops a boil in the skin and is healed, and in the place of the boil there comes a white swelling or a bright spot reddish white, then it shall be shown to the priest. And if, when the priest sees it, it indeed appears deeper than the skin, its hair has turned white, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprosious sore, which has broken out of the boil. But if the priest examines it, and indeed there are no white hairs in it, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall isolate him 7 days. And it should at all spread over the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprosious sore. But if the bright spot stays in one place and has not spread, it is a scar of the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Or if the body receives a burn on its skin by fire, and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a bright spot, reddish, white, or white, then the priest shall examine it, and indeed if the hair of the bright spot has turned white, and it appears deeper than the skin, it is leprosy broken out in the burn. Therefore the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprosious sore. But if the priest examines it, and indeed there are no white hairs in the bright spot, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall isolate him for 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day. If it has all spread over the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprosious sore. But if the bright spot stays in one place and has not spread on the skin, but has faded, it is a swelling from the burn. The priest shall pronounce him clean, for it is a scar from the burn. So we see in this text, long portion of text, that a boil that was inflamed or raw areas with whitened hairs was an infection, and it was looked at as to be still contagious. In verse 29 through 37 says, if a man or woman has a sore on the head or a beard, then the priest shall examine the sore. And indeed, if it appears deeper than the skin, and there is in it thin yellow hair, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is scaly leprosy, of the head or beard. But if the priest examines the scaly sore, and indeed it does not appear deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest shall isolate the one who has scale 7 days. And on the 7th day the priest shall examine the sore, and indeed if the scale has not spread, and there is no yellow hair in it, and the scale does not appear deeper than the skin, he shall shave himself, but the scale he shall not shave. And then the priest shall isolate the one who has a scale another 7 days. On the 7th day the priest shall examine the scale, and indeed if the scale has not spread over the skin, and does not appear deeper than the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scale should at all spread over the skin after his cleansing, then the priest shall examine him, and indeed if the scale has spread over the skin, the priest need not seek for yellow hair. He is unclean. But if the scale appears to be at a standstill, and there is black hair grown up in it, the scale has healed, he is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. So we see the focus on some inflammation from infection in these verses. In verse 38 through 44 says, if a man or a woman has bright spots on the skin of the body, specifically white bright spots, then the priest shall look, and indeed if it is bright spots on the skin, the body are dull white, it is a white spot that grows on the skin, he is clean. As for the man whose hair has fallen from his head, he is bald, but he is clean. He whose hair has fallen from his forehead, he is bald on the forehead, but he is clean. And if there is any on the bald head or bald forehead a reddish white sore, it is leprosy breaking out of his bald head or his bald forehead. Then the priest shall examine it. Indeed, if the swelling of the sore is reddish white on his bald head or on his bald forehead, as the appearance of leprosy on the skin of the body, he is a leprous man, he is unclean. The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean. His sore is on his head. So, same thing we see in these verses here. In verse 45-46, now the leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn and his head bare, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. He shall be unclean. All the days he has sore, he shall be unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So, unclean, unclean were the symbols of grief and isolation. And this is the same cry that we hear from the survivors of Jerusalem's destruction in Lamentations chapter 4, verse 15. And once leprosy was confirmed, they lived in a state of public disgrace, just like in the current pandemic with COVID. If you are unvaccinated in this world, you have employers that look at you as the lowest, and they don't want you in their workplace. And then we even see overall with the current president that he has divided the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. So they lived in a public disgrace once leprosy was confirmed, just like the unvaccinated live in public disgrace, or what it appears as between us today. And they were looked at as the walking dead, and the Jews thought they observed what they got as it was punishment from God. And that same mentality goes through the mindset of mankind today. When we see somebody get sick or terminally ill, or something really horrible happens to them, there's many people that wonder if God was punishing them. And Jewish custom was lepers shouldn't be greeted, and you had to socially distance from them 6 feet, which we know with the pandemic of COVID that social distance, we hear the number 6 feet come out as well. So a lot of the practices that we see in pandemic handling and public health crises, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, these aren't new things. These things are taught here in the Bible. And one rabbi boasted throwing rocks at lepers to keep them far from him. And I really wish I would have done this research at the very beginning of the pandemic. You know how fun it would have been throwing rocks at people that didn't keep their distance from you? But verse 47 through 59, the rest of the chapter, it says, "Also, if a garment has a leprous plague in it, whether it is woolen garment or a linen garment, whether it is in the warp or woof of linen or wool, whether the leather or in anything made of leather, and if the plague is greenish or reddish in the garment or in the leather, whether in the warp or in the woof, or if anything made of leather, it is leprous plague, and it shall be shown to the priest. The priest shall examine the plague and isolate that which has the plague 7 days, and he shall examine the plague on the 7th day. If the plague has spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, in the leather or anything made of leather, the plague is an active leprosy, it is unclean. He shall therefore burn the garment that in which it is the plague, whether warp or woof, in wool or in linen, or anything of leather, for it is active leprosy. The garment shall be burned in the fire. But the priest examines it, and indeed the plague has not spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, or anything made of leather, then the priest shall command that they wash the thing in which the plague, and he shall isolate it another 7 days. And the priest shall examine the plague after it has been washed. And indeed, if the plague has not changed its color, though the plague has not spread, it is unclean, and you shall burn it in the fire. It continues eaten away, whether the damage is outside or inside. If the priest examines it, and indeed the plague has faded after washing it, then he shall tear it out of the garment, whether out of the warp, or out of the woof, or out of the leather. But if it appears again in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, or in anything made of leather, it is spread in plague. You shall burn with fire that in which is the plague. And if you wash the garment, either warp or woof, or whatever is made of leather, if the plague has disappeared from it, then it shall be washed a second time, and shall be clean. And this is the law of the leprous plague in the garment of wool or linen, either in the warp or the woof, or anything made of leather, to pronounce it clean or to pronounce it unclean. So this section right here, it deals with the garments worn by infected persons. And in the Old Testament times, leprosy, the term, had a broad meaning behind it, a broad definition, and it included some forms of mold and fungi. And the priest had to make careful determination to see if the garment might pass on the contagious disease, or if it could still be used. So to wrap up here, we see this amazing chapter that we're looking at in a biblical way of handling a public health crisis among people. And we look at instructions for the priest on how to diagnose leprosy and the method of examination for leprosy. And we see the focus of protecting the community from the outbreak of the disease rather than the focus should be on the rights of the individual. And quarantine was practiced even back 1,500 years before Christ, or whenever the Book of Leviticus was written. And we looked further on the diagnosis of leprosy, and leprosy gives, in the Bible, it really gives us a picture of sin and its spiritual operation among us and human beings. And it begins as nothing, and it's painless in the first stages. Most sin that we do, it is painless when we first do it, but it grows slowly, and it even seems to go a while and then returns. Sometimes, we'll think that we're conquering something and we'll fall right back into it. And it number senses causes decay and deformity. And sin is as devastating infection, and spiritual cleansing is essential to deal with sin. And we looked at the result of leprosy, and thankfully today, leprosy does still exist in the world. However, we do have drugs and treatments that have come out of the medical world for leprosy. However, there are still over approximately 15 million people in the world that make up mostly third world countries that still battle with leprosy. In the passage, it gives us a picture how God desires purity and holiness and cleansedness from among his people. And how did Jesus treat lepers? Did Jesus treat them as outcasts? Did Jesus treat them differently among mankind? Let's look at Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. It says, "When he had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him, and behold, a leper came and worshipped him, saying, 'Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean.' Then Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, 'I am willing, be cleansed.' After his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, 'See that you tell no one, but go on your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them.'" So we see that Jesus loved the lepers as he touched this leper right here, and he healed him and cleansed him. And this leper had no hope at all without what Jesus did right there. And Jesus gave him hope when Jesus healed him. And that's going to wrap up this video. But talking about COVID, whether someone gets COVID or not, vaccinated or unvaccinated, when people come down sick, we should feel bad for them and we should sympathize with them. We shouldn't be divided and treat people different just because of medical practices that they choose in regards to vaccinations or not. And those who are not into vaccinations, because they get COVID, we shouldn't treat them different. So I hope you have a great rest of your night. This wraps up right here. We'll see you on tomorrow. We're going to do a topical video on a topic that will be announced. So I hope you have a great weekend, and God bless.